The blood dripped from her palms onto the rough-hewn logs. She was struggling to drag across the muddy ground, and she didn't even seem to notice any more through the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones. Thomas Aldridge had been watching the young woman from his position near the trading post for the better part of an hour, his jaw tightening with each passing minute as he observed her futile attempts to move timber that would challenge even a seasoned man. The mountains of Northern California had hardened him over his 32 years, particularly the last decade spent trapping and hunting in the wilderness surrounding Petaluma. But something about the sight of this woman's determination, mixed with her obvious pain, stirred something protective in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He strode toward her with purposeful steps, his muscular frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun of June, 1872. His shoulder-length dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, and his weathered buckskin shirt stretched across his broad shoulders as he moved. The woman didn't notice his approach until his large, calloused hands gently but firmly took hold of her wrists. "That's enough," he said, his voice a deep rumble that brooked no argument. She looked up at him with startled blue eyes, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably around 23, with auburn hair that had mostly escaped its pins to hang in damp tendrils around her face. "I have to finish this before nightfall. Mr. Crawford said if I don't get these logs moved to the back of his property, he won't pay me, and I need that money for food and rent." Thomas examined her hands, turning them palm up despite her weak attempt to pull away. The skin was torn and bleeding in multiple places. Blisters had burst and bled, and splinters were embedded in the raw flesh. His expression darkened. "Crawford said that, did he? Please, I can't afford to lose this work. There aren't many opportunities for a woman alone in this town." Her voice cracked slightly, whether from exhaustion or emotion, he couldn't tell. Without releasing her wrists, Thomas called over his shoulder to a boy loitering near the post. "Danny, go fetch my saddlebag from inside. Tell them it's Thomas Aldridge asking." The boy scurried off, and Thomas finally released the woman's wrists, though his touch remained gentle. "What's your name?" "Penelope Winters," she said, attempting to wipe her face with her sleeve and only succeeding in smearing more dirt across her cheek. "And I appreciate your concern, but I really do need to finish this work. You're going to get infection in those hands if they're not tended to properly, Miss Winters. Then you won't be able to work at all for weeks, maybe longer." Thomas kept his voice level but firm. "I'm going to wrap your hands and then I'm going to move these logs myself." "You can't do that. This is my job, my responsibility." "It's already done," Thomas said as the boy returned with his saddlebag. He fished out a clean cloth and a small tin of salve that he'd gotten from a Miwok woman who lived in the foothills. The salve was made from herbs and animal fat, and he'd seen it work miracles on wounds that should have festered. "This is going to sting." Penelope tried to pull her hands back, but Thomas held them steady with surprising gentleness given his size and obvious strength. As he began to clean the wounds, she hissed in pain but didn't cry out. He found himself admiring her fortitude, even as he disapproved of whatever circumstances had brought her to this point. "How did you end up working for Crawford?" he asked, partly to distract her from the pain and partly because he genuinely wanted to know. "I came to Petaluma 6 months ago from Sacramento. My father died last winter, and there was nothing left for me there. I'd heard there was work in the smaller towns, that a woman could make an honest living if she was willing to work hard." She laughed bitterly. "Turns out the kind of work available to a woman alone is either in the saloons or breaking her back doing labor no one else wants to do for half the pay a man would get." Thomas applied the salve with careful attention, making sure to cover every scrape and cut. Her hands were small in his large ones, and he could feel them trembling slightly. "You have any family at all?" "No. It was just my father and me after my mother died giving birth to what would have been my brother. That was 16 years ago." Penelope watched his face as he worked, noting the concentration in his dark eyes, the gentleness in hands that looked like they could snap wood as easily as twigs. "You're very kind to help me, Mr. Aldridge. I'll find a way to repay you. No need for that." He began wrapping her hands with long strips of cloth, ensuring the bandages were secure but not too tight. "And you can call me Thomas. Mr. Aldridge was my father, and he's been dead 10 years now. Then you should call me Penelope, or Penny, as my father used to." Thomas finished with her hands and looked directly into her eyes. "Penelope suits you better. It's a name with dignity, and you strike me as a woman who's holding on to her dignity despite circumstances that would break most people." She felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun or her exertion. "Thank you, Thomas." He stood to his full height, which was easily over 6 feet, and rolled up his sleeves to reveal forearms corded with muscle. "Now, you're going to sit over there on that stump and rest while I move these logs. I don't want to hear any arguments about it. But Mr. Crawford will see you helping me. He might not pay me at all if he thinks I didn't do the work. Then I'll have words with Crawford." The tone in Thomas's voice suggested those words wouldn't be pleasant ones. Penelope did as she was told, partly because her hands were throbbing too badly to argue and partly because something about Thomas's presence made her feel safe for the first time since arriving in this rough town. She watched as he grabbed the first log, the one she'd been struggling with for 20 minutes, and lifted it with an ease that seemed almost casual. His muscles flexed under his shirt as he carried it across the property to where Crawford had indicated they should go. For the next 2 hours, Penelope sat and watched Thomas work. He moved with the efficient grace of a man accustomed to hard physical labor, never wasting motion, never slowing his pace. The pile of logs that had seemed insurmountable to her dwindled steadily. Other people passing by on the street glanced their way with curiosity, and Penelope knew the gossips would have a field day with this. A strange mountain man doing work for the newcomer woman. She should probably care more about her reputation, but she found she was too tired and too grateful to worry about it. As the sun began to sink lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas moved the last log into place. He walked back to where Penelope sat, breathing only slightly harder than normal despite the labor. "That's done." "I don't know how to thank you properly," Penelope said, standing up. Her legs were stiff from sitting, and she stumbled slightly. Thomas steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "You already did." He studied her face in the fading light. She looked exhausted, and he suspected she hadn't been eating enough either. "When did you last have a proper meal?" "I had bread this morning." "Just bread? It's what I could afford." Penelope lifted her chin, defensive despite her gratitude. "I'm managing just fine." "You're half-starved and working yourself to death. That's not managing fine." Thomas made a decision then, one that surprised him given that he'd always been a solitary man who kept to himself. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over, run by Mrs. Chen. She's a decent woman who serves good food at fair prices. I'm buying you dinner." "I couldn't possibly accept that." "You can and you will. Because otherwise those hands aren't going to heal properly, and all my work wrapping them will be wasted." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it, but something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that this connection, however it had started, was something neither of them wanted to end just yet. Penelope found herself nodding. "All right, but just this once." They walked together through the streets of Petaluma as evening settled over the town. The main street was busy with people finishing their daily business, saloons beginning to fill with men looking for drink and entertainment, shops closing their doors. Thomas noticed how people looked at them, some with curiosity, some with disapproval. He'd never cared much for what people thought, but he found himself wanting to shield Penelope from judgment. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a neat two-story building painted white with green shutters. The proprietor herself was a Chinese woman in her 50s who had come to California during the gold rush with her now deceased husband. She'd built a reputation for running a clean, respectable establishment that welcomed people of all backgrounds as long as they paid their bills and caused no trouble. "Thomas Aldridge," she said with a smile as they entered. "I have not seen you in town for 3 weeks. I thought perhaps a bear finally got you." "Not yet, Mrs. Chen. This is Penelope Winters. We need 2 plates of whatever you have hot tonight, and I need to settle my account with you." Mrs. Chen's sharp eyes took in Penelope's appearance, the bandaged hands, the exhaustion, and the way Thomas stood slightly protectively near her. "Sit, sit. I have beef stew tonight, very good, and fresh bread." She disappeared into the kitchen, calling out instructions in Cantonese to someone Penelope couldn't see. They sat at one of the long tables in the dining room. A few other boarders were scattered about, eating their meals and talking quietly. Thomas removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, and Penelope found herself studying him more openly now that they were in better light. His face was weathered from years outdoors, with fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his serious demeanor indicated. His jaw was strong and covered with several days' worth of dark stubble. He was, she realized, quite handsome in a rugged, untamed way. "How long have you been a mountain man?" she asked. "About 10 years, give or take. I came west from Missouri after my father died. Tried my hand at various things before I found I preferred being in the wilderness more than in towns. But you come into Petaluma for supplies. Every few weeks, yes, I trade furs and meat for what I need. It's a simple life, but it suits me." Thomas paused as Mrs. Chen brought them 2 steaming bowls of stew and a basket of bread. The smell made Penelope's stomach growl audibly, and she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Eat," Thomas said simply, and they both did. The stew was rich and hearty, full of tender beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions in a thick gravy. Penelope had to eat slowly because her bandaged hands made holding the spoon awkward, but she savored every bite. It was the best meal she'd had in weeks, maybe months. "Tell me about Sacramento," Thomas said between bites. "What did you do there?" "My father was a clerk in a law office. We had a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but it was home. I kept house for him and took in sewing work to help with expenses. After he died, I discovered he'd been in debt, gambling debts mostly. Everything we had went to pay his creditors, and I was left with almost nothing." The words came easier than she expected. Maybe it was the food or the exhaustion or something about Thomas that made her feel she could speak freely. "I could have stayed, found work as a seamstress or a maid, but I wanted a fresh start somewhere smaller, quieter. I thought Petaluma would be that place. Has it been?" Penelope considered the question. "Not exactly. It's smaller than Sacramento, certainly, but making a living here has been harder than I expected. There's not much call for sewing, and the other work available to women is limited unless you're willing to compromise your morals. I've been taking whatever odd jobs I can find, like today's work with Mr. Crawford, but it's barely enough to pay for my room and food." "Where are you staying?" "A boarding house on the south side of town. It's not as nice as this one, but it's what I can afford, barely." Thomas frowned. The south side was known for being rough, with buildings that were poorly maintained and neighbors who were often drunk or violent. It was no place for a woman alone. That's not safe. It's what I have. Penelope's voice was quiet but firm. I'm grateful for your help today, Thomas. Truly I am. But I don't expect you to solve all my problems. I'll figure something out. I'm not trying to solve all your problems. I'm just saying that particular place isn't safe, especially for a woman alone. Thomas finished his stew and leaned back slightly. Mrs. Chen, you have any rooms available? The proprietor appeared from the kitchen as if she'd been waiting for the question. I have one small room on the second floor. It is clean, has a good bed, and includes 2 meals a day. $8 a month. $8. Penelope's heart sank. She was currently paying $5 a month for her dismal room, and even that was stretching her finances to the breaking point. I appreciate the offer, but I can't afford that. What if the rate was $5 a month? Mrs. Chen looked at Thomas as she spoke. Now hold on, Penelope said, understanding immediately what was being suggested. I won't accept charity. It's not charity, Thomas said. Consider it an investment. You need a safe place to stay and regular meals so you can get healthy and find better work. Once you're on your feet, you pay Mrs. Chen the full rate. Until then, I'll cover the difference. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. It was a fair question, and Thomas took a moment to consider his answer. Because I've seen too many good people get ground down by circumstances beyond their control, and because something tells me you're worth helping. Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back stubbornly. She'd cried enough over the past months. But the kindness of this stranger, this mountain man who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, was almost overwhelming. I will pay you back, every cent. We can worry about that later. For now, do we have an agreement? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Mrs. Chen smiled broadly. Good. Penelope, you come by tomorrow with your things. I will have the room ready for you. After dinner, Thomas insisted on walking Penelope back to her current lodgings despite her protests. The streets were darker now, lit only by lamps from windows and the occasional torch outside saloons and shops. The sounds of piano music and raucous laughter drifted from the drinking establishments. I usually come to town every 3 weeks or so, Thomas said as they walked. While you're getting settled, if you need anything, you can leave a message for me at the trading post. The owner, Jim Sullivan, knows how to reach me. You're going back to the mountains tomorrow morning, yes. I have traps to check and a cabin that needs repairs before winter. He glanced at her. Will you be all right? Yes, thanks to you, I'll be more than all right. I'll be safe and fed, which is more than I had this morning. They reached the boarding house, which looked even more run-down compared to Mrs. Chen's establishment. The front porch sagged, and one of the windows was covered with boards instead of glass. Thomas's jaw tightened at the sight of it. Tomorrow you pack up your things and get out of here. I will, I promise. Penelope turned to face him in the dim light. Thank you, Thomas, for everything. For my hands, for the work, for the meal, for the room. I don't know what I did to deserve such kindness from a stranger, but I'm grateful. You didn't have to do anything to deserve basic human decency. Thomas reached out and gently lifted one of her bandaged hands. Change these wrappings tomorrow night and apply more salve. Keep them clean and dry as much as possible. They should heal within a week or 2 if you're careful. I will. She could feel the warmth of his hand through the bandages, steady and reassuring. Will I see you when you come back to town? If you want to, I do. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softness that hadn't been there before. Then you will. Take care of yourself, Penelope. You too, Thomas. Be safe in the mountains. He tipped his hat to her and waited until she'd gone inside before turning to walk back toward where he'd left his horse at the stable. As he walked, Thomas found himself thinking about blue eyes and auburn hair, about determination and dignity in the face of hardship, about small hands torn and bleeding from work that should never have been hers to do. He told himself it was simple compassion that had driven him to help her, the same compassion he'd shown to injured animals or travelers in need. But as he saddled his horse and prepared to ride back to his cabin in the mountains, he knew it was more than that. Something about Penelope Winters had gotten under his skin in a way no one had in years, maybe ever. The ride back to his cabin took most of the night. Thomas knew the trails well enough to travel them in darkness, and his horse was sure-footed and familiar with the route. As the stars wheeled overhead and the cool night air filled his lungs, he thought about the life he'd built for himself in the wilderness. It was a good life, peaceful and free, but also lonely. He told himself he preferred it that way, that he didn't need the complications that came with other people. But tonight, that solitude felt different somehow, emptier than it had before. His cabin was nestled in a small valley surrounded by pine trees, with a creek running nearby that provided fresh water year-round. He'd built it himself over the course of several months, cutting and fitting each log, constructing the stone fireplace, installing the door and shutters that could be barred against predators or harsh weather. It was solid and well-made, large enough for a man alone, with a sleeping loft, a cooking area, and space for storing his supplies and the furs he collected. As dawn broke and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Thomas unsaddled his horse and turned it loose in the small corral behind the cabin. He should sleep, he knew. He'd been awake for over 24 hours. But instead, he found himself standing on his porch, looking out at the mountains, thinking about a woman with bleeding hands and indomitable spirit. Meanwhile, back in Petaluma, Penelope lay awake in her sagging bed, listening to the sounds of arguments and breaking glass from somewhere in the building. Tomorrow she would move to Mrs. Chen's boarding house. Tomorrow she would start fresh with a safe place to stay and regular meals. And all of it was thanks to a mountain man named Thomas Aldridge, who had shown her more kindness in one afternoon than most people had shown her in months. She looked at her bandaged hands in the dim light filtering through the threadbare curtains. They still hurt, but the throbbing had eased somewhat, and the salve Thomas had used had a cooling effect that was soothing. She thought about the way he'd wrapped them so carefully, as if they were something precious that needed protecting. She thought about his dark eyes, his quiet strength, the way his presence had made her feel safe. Don't be foolish, she told herself. He was just being kind. He'll probably forget all about you by the time he comes back to town. But even as she thought it, she didn't quite believe it. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity for Penelope. True to her word, she moved to Mrs. Chen's boarding house the day after meeting Thomas. The room was small but clean, with a real bed that didn't sag, a washstand with a mirror, a small wardrobe, and a window that looked out onto the street. After the place she'd been staying, it felt like luxury. Mrs. Chen proved to be not just a landlady, but also a source of information and connections. She knew everyone in town and heard all the gossip. Within a week of Penelope moving in, Mrs. Chen had found her work doing alterations for the dress shop on Main Street. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and the work was indoors and didn't destroy her hands. "You have a good hand with a needle," Mrs. Chen observed one evening as Penelope worked on a dress hem in the common room. "This is much better work than moving logs." "It is," Penelope agreed, "though I have Thomas to thank for making it possible. If he hadn't helped me that day, I'd probably have gotten infection in my hands and been unable to work at all." "Thomas Aldridge is a good man," Mrs. Chen said. "A little wild, a little rough around the edges, but a good heart. He saved my life once, did you know? No, what happened? 3 years ago, winter. I went into the foothills to collect herbs, got turned around, and could not find my way back before dark. Temperature was dropping, snow was coming. I would have frozen to death, but Thomas found me. He carried me on his back all the way to his cabin, kept me warm by his fire, and then brought me home the next day when the weather cleared. He would not accept any payment, said it was what any decent person would do. Mrs. Chen smiled. But it is not what just any person would do, it is what a good man does. Penelope absorbed this information, adding it to what she knew about Thomas. Each piece created a fuller picture of a man who lived by a code of honor that seemed increasingly rare. As the days passed, she found herself thinking about him more than she should. She would see a tall man on the street, and her heart would jump, only to sink when she realized it wasn't Thomas. She would hear horses arriving in town and crane her neck to see if one of the riders was a mountain man with long dark hair and broad shoulders. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that he was just someone who had helped her, nothing more. But at night, lying in her comfortable bed, she would remember the gentleness of his hands as he'd wrapped her wounds, the protective way he'd stood near her, the look in his eyes when she'd said she wanted to see him again. And she would wonder if he thought about her too, up in his mountain cabin, alone with the wilderness. Thomas, for his part, was thinking about Penelope far more than he was comfortable admitting. He went about his daily routines, checking his trap lines, hunting for fresh meat, repairing the section of his cabin roof that had leaked during the last rain. But his mind kept drifting back to town, to a woman with blue eyes and auburn hair. He told himself he was just concerned about her welfare, that he wanted to make sure she was settled safely at Mrs. Chen's place. But he knew it was more than that. He found himself counting the days until he would normally return to town for supplies, then trying to think of reasons to go earlier. He needed more coffee. He wanted to check on a saddle repair at the leatherworker's shop. He should see if Jim Sullivan had received the ammunition he'd ordered. They were all flimsy excuses, and he knew it. On the 20th day after he'd met Penelope, Thomas gave in to the urge that had been building in him. He saddled his horse, loaded up a few furs to trade, and headed for Petaluma. The ride that normally felt peaceful and meditative seemed to take forever. He found himself urging his horse to move faster, then forcing himself to slow down and act like a reasonable adult instead of an eager boy. It was late afternoon when he arrived in town. He stopped first at the trading post to conduct his business with Jim Sullivan. The trader looked at him with barely concealed amusement. "Back already, Thomas. Didn't expect to see you for another week at least. Needed some supplies sooner than I thought." Thomas unloaded his furs and began the familiar process of negotiating trades. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain auburn-haired woman you were seen helping a few weeks back, would it? A man can't help someone without the whole town making assumptions. Jim laughed. Not in Petaluma, he can't. Besides, the woman in question has been asking after you. Casual-like, but asking nonetheless. Thomas felt something warm unfold in his chest at that information. She doing all right. Got settled at Mrs. Chen's place. As far as I know, yes. Saw her yesterday, actually. She was coming out of the dress shop where she's been doing work. Looked a lot healthier than she did that day you helped her. After finishing his business at the trading post, Thomas made his way to Mrs. Chen's boarding house. His heart was beating faster than normal, and he felt almost nervous, which was absurd. He'd faced down bears and mountain lions without breaking a sweat, but the prospect of seeing Penelope again had his hands feeling unsteady. Mrs. Chen answered his knock with a knowing smile. "Thomas Aldridge, I thought you might be back soon. Is Penelope here?" "She is upstairs in her room." I will get her." Mrs. Chen disappeared up the stairs, and Thomas removed his hat, running a hand through his hair and feeling foolish for caring how he looked. Then Penelope was coming down the stairs, and everything else fell away. She looked different than she had 3 weeks ago. Healthier, for one thing. Her face had more color and she'd clearly been eating regularly. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes and her hair was neatly pinned up. But it was the smile on her face when she saw him that made Thomas's breath catch. "Thomas, you're back." "I am." He suddenly felt tongue-tied, which was not a familiar sensation. "Wanted to check on your hands, make sure they healed properly." Penelope descended the last few stairs and held out her hands for his inspection. The bandages were long gone, and her palms showed pink new skin where the worst of the damage had been. A few faint scars remained, but overall, the healing was complete. Thomas took her hands in his, examining them carefully, aware that he was probably holding them longer than strictly necessary for a medical assessment. "They healed well. No infection, good color. You took proper care of them." "I followed your instructions exactly." Penelope made no move to pull her hands away. "I owe you so much, Thomas. Mrs. Chen found me work at the dress shop and I've been doing alterations. It's steady work and they're pleased with what I've done. They've even talked about increasing my hours." "That's good. Real good." Thomas finally released her hands, though he did so reluctantly. "You like it here? Feel safe?" "Very much so. Mrs. Chen has been wonderful and the other boarders are nice people. I have my own room, regular meals, and meaningful work. It's everything I hoped for when I came to Petaluma." She paused, then added softly, "All because you helped me. You'd have figured something out on your own. Maybe, but it would have taken much longer and probably involved more suffering. You gave me a chance when I needed it most." Penelope glanced at Mrs. Chen, who was watching them with undisguised interest from the doorway to the kitchen. "Would you like to take a walk? It's a nice evening." "I'd like that." They walked through the town as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Penelope showed Thomas where the dress shop was located, pointing out the window display that she'd helped create. They walked past the church, the schoolhouse, the various shops and businesses that made up the heart of Petaluma. And they talked, the conversation flowing easily between them. Thomas told her about his cabin in the mountains, about the routines of his days, about the wildlife he encountered, and the peace he found in solitude. Penelope told him about the dresses she'd altered, about the gossip she overheard at the boarding house, about her growing friendship with Mrs. Chen. They talked about books they'd read, places they'd been, memories from childhood. "My father used to take me fishing when I was young," Penelope said as they walked along the creek that ran on the edge of town. "Before my mother died, before he started drinking and gambling. We'd go out early in the morning, just the two of us, and spend hours by the water. Those are my best memories of him." "Sounds like he was a good man once." "He was. Grief changed him, made him bitter and reckless. I tried to help him, but you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Penelope looked at the water flowing past, shimmering in the evening light. "Do you fish in the mountains?" "All the time. The streams up there are full of trout. I smoke what I don't eat fresh, save it for winter." "That sounds wonderful, peaceful." "It is." Thomas watched her face, the way the fading sunlight brought out the red highlights in her hair. "Would you like to see it sometime? The mountains, I mean, my cabin." Penelope turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you inviting me to visit?" "I am, if you'd be interested." "It's a day's ride from here, but the trail's not too difficult. We could go on a Saturday and Sunday, if you have those days free. I could show you the high meadows where the wildflowers bloom, the waterfall about a mile from my cabin, the view from the ridge where you can see all the way to the valley." "I'd love that." The words came without hesitation. "When?" This coming Saturday if the weather holds. We'd leave early in the morning, spend the day and night at my cabin, and I'd bring you back Sunday evening. Won't people talk about me going off alone with you for a night? Thomas had considered this. Probably. But you'd be perfectly safe, and I'd protect your reputation as much as possible. You could tell Mrs. Chen the truth and ask if she'd vouch for your whereabouts if anyone asks. But yes, people will likely talk regardless. Penelope thought about it for a moment, weighing her reputation against the desire that had been growing in her heart for 3 weeks. I don't care if they talk. I want to see your world, Thomas. I want to understand the place that makes you who you are. The warmth in Thomas's chest expanded into something bigger, something he was starting to recognize as more than just attraction or concern. Then we'll go. Bring warm clothes, even though it's summer. The nights are cool up there. They walked back to Mrs. Chen's boarding house as full darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the sky above. At the door, they stood facing each other, neither quite ready to say goodbye. I'm glad you came back to town, Penelope said softly. So am I. Thomas reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture tender and intimate. I'll be by Saturday morning at first light. Be ready. I will be. Thomas left her standing on the porch, her hand pressed to the cheek he'd touched, her heart beating fast with anticipation for what Saturday would bring. The days until Saturday seemed to crawl by for both of them. Penelope went about her work at the dress shop with distracted efficiency, her mind constantly drifting to thoughts of mountain trails and log cabins, and a tall, strong man who made her feel things she'd never felt before. Mrs. Chen noticed her preoccupation and smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Thomas, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing his cabin for Penelope's visit. He cleaned everything thoroughly, changed the bedding, made sure his supplies were well stocked. He told himself he was just being a good host, but he knew it went deeper than that. He wanted Penelope to like his home, to understand why he loved the mountains, to see the beauty that surrounded him every day. When Saturday morning arrived, Penelope was awake before dawn. She dressed in her most practical clothes, a split riding skirt she'd borrowed from Mrs. Chen, a simple blouse and a warm jacket. She packed a small bag with a change of clothes and her other necessities, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Mrs. Chen met her in the kitchen, where she was preparing a packet of food for the journey. You are sure about this? I am. Thomas is a good man, but he is also very much a man of the wilderness. His ways are not the ways of town folk. I know. That's part of what draws me to him, I think. He's honest and direct in a way that people in towns often aren't. Penelope accepted the food packet gratefully. Thank you for this, and for everything else. You remind me of myself when I was young, Mrs. Chen said. Following my heart even when it was not the practical thing to do, it led me to many adventures, some hard, some wonderful. I do not regret any of it. Thomas arrived just as the sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. He had brought a second horse, a gentle mare that he said was good with inexperienced riders. Penelope had ridden before but not extensively, and she appreciated his consideration. They set out from town as Petaluma was just beginning to wake up. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers. As they rode, Thomas pointed out landmarks and explained the route they were taking. The trail led gradually upward, following the contours of the foothills before entering the deeper forest. The trees grew taller and closer together, pines and firs that blocked out much of the sun and created a peaceful green twilight. Birds called from the branches, and occasionally they would see deer or rabbits crossing the path ahead of them. Penelope found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride. her body adjusting to the horse's movements, her senses coming alive to the beauty around her. Thomas was an easy companion, content with silence when words weren't needed but ready with information or stories when she asked questions. "How did you learn to survive in the wilderness?" she asked during one of their conversations. "Partly from my father, who was a hunter back in Missouri. Partly from trial and error, and partly from the native people I've encountered over the years. They know this land better than any white man ever will, and they've taught me much about plants, animals, weather patterns, all the things you need to know to live in harmony with nature rather than fighting against it." "You ever get lonely up here?" Thomas considered the question. "Sometimes. But there's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Solitude is peaceful, restorative. Loneliness is painful, a longing for connection. I've had plenty of the first and thought I'd made peace with occasionally feeling the second." He glanced at her. "Until recently. Until recently. Until I met a woman with bleeding hands who refused to give up despite circumstances that would have broken most people. Since then, solitude has felt more like loneliness than I care to admit." Penelope felt her breath catch at the honesty in his words. "I felt lonely for most of my life, even when my father was alive. Lonely in Sacramento, lonely in Petaluma, alone in my room at night. But I don't feel lonely when I'm with you." They stopped around midday at a small clearing beside a stream. Thomas helped Penelope dismount, his hands steady at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. They sat on smooth rocks beside the water and ate the food Mrs. Chen had packed, along with the dried meat and biscuits Thomas had brought. "This is beautiful," Penelope said, watching the water flow past, crystal clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. "So peaceful." "We're about halfway to my cabin. How are you holding up?" "Saddle sore, a little, but not too bad. I'm tougher than I look." "I know you are. I saw that the day we met." Thomas studied her face, the way her eyes reflected the sky, the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Penelope, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I don't do this. Invite people to my cabin, share my space, spend time with anyone really. I've been alone for so long that I thought it was what I wanted, what I needed. But being with you feels different. It feels right in a way nothing else has for years." Penelope set down the biscuit she'd been eating and turned to face him fully. "Thomas, I came on this trip because I feel the same way. When you left town 3 weeks ago, I counted the days until you might return. I asked after you at the trading post, probably too obviously. I dreamed about seeing you again, and when you showed up at Mrs. Chen's, I felt happier than I have in years, maybe ever. I need you to know that I mean you no dishonor by bringing you here. My intentions toward you are serious, Penelope. I'm not a man who plays games or trifles with a woman's feelings. I know that. I trust you, Thomas." He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I'm falling in love with you. I've probably been falling since the moment I saw you struggling with those logs, too stubborn to quit, too proud to ask for help. And these past 3 weeks away from you have only made me more certain." Tears filled Penelope's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I'm falling in love with you too. With your kindness, your strength, your gentleness, the way you see me as someone worth caring for when so many others have looked right through me." Thomas stood, pulling her gently to her feet and cupped her face in his large hands. "May I kiss you, please?" He lowered his mouth to hers, and the world seemed to stop. The kiss was tender at first, almost tentative, as if they were both afraid of the intensity of what they were feeling. But then it deepened, became more certain, a confirmation of everything they'd just said to each other. Penelope's hands came up to rest on Thomas's chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the steady beat of his heart. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, protective and possessive and reverent all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads resting together. "We should keep moving," Thomas said, his voice rough. "I want to get to the cabin before late afternoon." They rode the rest of the way in a state of heightened awareness of each other. Every glance became significant. Every accidental brush of hands or legs as the horses walked close together sent sparks through both of them. The trail grew steeper, winding up through increasingly spectacular scenery. They emerged from the forest into high meadows carpeted with wildflowers in every color: purple lupine, golden California poppies, white yarrow, pink mountain heather. "Oh, Thomas," Penelope breathed, pulling her horse to a stop. "It's like something from a dream." "Wait until you see the view from the ridge." He pointed to a rocky outcropping above them. "We'll go up there before sunset if you're not too tired." The cabin came into view as they crested a small rise. It was exactly as Penelope had imagined it. A solid log structure with a stone chimney, shuttered windows, and a covered porch. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with the creek Thomas had mentioned running nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Penelope realized he must have left a fire banked before leaving for town. "It's perfect," she said as they approached. "Absolutely perfect." Thomas helped her down from her horse and led both animals to the corral behind the cabin. Penelope followed, looking around with open curiosity. Everything was neat and well maintained. There was a small garden with vegetables growing, a shed for storing wood and supplies, a rack for stretching and drying animal hides. "Come inside," Thomas said, taking her bag and leading the way. The interior of the cabin was simply furnished, but comfortable. The main room contained a table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with a cooking pot hanging over the banked fire, shelves holding supplies and equipment, and a comfortable-looking chair near the hearth. A ladder led up to a sleeping loft. The walls were lined with pegs holding various items: snowshoes, a rifle, extra clothing, cooking utensils. Animal skins served as rugs on the wooden floor. "This is wonderful," Penelope said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "It's like a whole world contained in one room. It's enough for me, or it has been." Thomas set her bag down and stirred up the fire, adding more wood. "There's a basin on the shelf there if you want to wash up from the ride. The water in the bucket is fresh from the creek this morning. I'll see to the horses and then show you around." While Thomas was outside, Penelope explored the cabin more thoroughly. She washed her face and hands, ran damp fingers through her hair to tidy it. She examined the books on one of the shelves, a small collection but well-worn: Shakespeare, Thoreau, a Bible, some volumes about natural history. On the mantel above the fireplace was a small tintype photograph of a stern-looking couple she assumed were Thomas's parents. She climbed the ladder to peek at the sleeping loft, and found it cozy, with a large bed covered in quilts and furs, a small window that let in light and air, and more shelves holding Thomas's personal items. It was intimate, seeing this private space, and she backed down the ladder feeling like she'd intruded. Thomas returned and found her standing by the fireplace, looking at the photograph. "Your parents?" "Yes, that was taken right before we left Missouri. My mother died of fever 2 years later, my father 5 years after that. I'm sorry. It's hard losing parents." "It is." He moved to stand beside her. "But life goes on, and you learn to carry the grief alongside everything else. They were good people who loved me, and that's what I try to remember." They spent the afternoon exploring the area around the cabin. Thomas showed her the waterfall, a spectacular cascade that tumbled down a rocky cliff into a pool so clear you could see every stone on the bottom. He showed her the meadow where he'd seen a mother bear and her cubs just last week. He pointed out various plants, explaining which were edible, which had medicinal properties, which to avoid. As the sun began to sink lower, they climbed to the ridge Thomas had mentioned. The view from the top was breathtaking. Miles and miles of mountains and valleys stretching in every direction, the town of Petaluma visible as a small cluster of buildings in the distance. The sky painted in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple as sunset approached. "I can see why you love it here," Penelope said softly. "It's like standing on top of the world." "It grounds me," Thomas said. "When I'm up here, everything that seemed complicated in town becomes simple. The mountain doesn't care about money or status or what people think. It just is, and you either respect it and live, or you don't and you die. There's a clarity to that I find comforting." They sat on the sun-warmed rocks and watched as the sun sank below the horizon, the colors intensifying before slowly fading. Stars began to emerge, more stars than Penelope had ever seen in her life, the Milky Way a broad river of light across the sky. "I could stay here forever," she whispered. "Would you want to?" She looked at him, his profile outlined against the darkening sky. "If you were here with me, yes." Thomas turned to her, his eyes intense. "I'm serious about you, Penelope. More serious than I've been about anything in a long time. But you need to understand what that means. I'm not a town man. I can't give you fancy dresses or a big house or the kind of life you might have had in Sacramento. This cabin, these mountains, this simple life, this is who I am. I don't want fancy dresses or a big house. I want a life that means something, with someone who values me for who I am. I want to wake up in the morning and know that I'm loved and safe. I want to build something real with someone I respect and admire." She took his hand. "I want that with you, Thomas." He pulled her close and kissed her again, this kiss deeper and more passionate than the one by the stream. When they finally broke apart, the stars were fully out, and the air had turned cool. "We should head back to the cabin," Thomas said reluctantly. "It gets cold quickly up here once the sun goes down." They made their way back down the trail in the gathering darkness, Thomas leading the way with sure steps born of long familiarity. At the cabin, he built up the fire until it was roaring, filling the space with warmth and flickering light. He prepared a simple dinner of fried trout he'd caught that morning, along with potatoes and beans. They ate together at the small table, talking about everything and nothing. Penelope asked more about his life, and Thomas shared stories about winter storms that had snowed him in for days, about close calls with wild animals, about the satisfaction of living by his own skill and strength. "What about children?" Penelope asked as they were finishing the meal. "Have you ever thought about having a family?" "I have, though I'd mostly set the idea aside. Out here alone, it didn't seem practical. But with the right woman, I'd want that. Sons and daughters to teach about the mountains, to pass on what I know." He studied her face. "Is that something you want?" "Very much. I always imagined having a house full of children, lots of noise and laughter and love, a family built on a stronger foundation than the one I grew up in." "We could have that, Penelope. Here or wherever you'd be happy. I could build a bigger cabin, one with proper rooms for children. The mountains are a good place to raise a family, or we could find somewhere in between, close enough to town for supplies and a school but far enough out for privacy. You'd be willing to compromise like that?" "For you, yes. I love the wilderness, but I love you more." Penelope felt tears well up again at his words. "We've only known each other for a month. I know. But I also know what I feel, and I know quality when I see it. You're strong and brave and kind. You've proven you can handle hardship without losing your spirit. You appreciate beauty but don't need luxury. You're exactly the kind of woman I didn't dare hope existed." She stood and moved around the table to him. Thomas pushed his chair back and she settled onto his lap, her arms around his neck. "I love you, Thomas Aldridge. I know it's fast and maybe foolish, but I do. I love you too, Penelope Winters, and it's not foolish if we're both sure." They kissed again, long and deep, the fire crackling beside them, the cabin a warm haven against the cool night outside. When they finally pulled apart, both flushed and breathing hard, Thomas gently set her on her feet. "You should take the bed in the loft tonight," he said, his voice rough. "I'll sleep down here by the fire." "Thomas, I'm not asking you to compromise your honor or mine, but I don't want to sleep apart from you. Can we just lie together, hold each other? That would be enough." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but Penelope, you need to know that my control only goes so far. Being close to you tests it. I trust you, and I trust myself. We'll know when the time is right." They banked the fire for the night and climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft. The bed was large and comfortable, piled with quilts and furs. They removed their shoes but remained otherwise clothed. Thomas lay on his back and Penelope curled against his side, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. "I can hear your heartbeat," she murmured. "It beats for you." She smiled at the simple romantic declaration. "Tell me about your dreams, Thomas. What do you want for your future?" "I want to build something that lasts. A good home, a strong family, a life that matters beyond just surviving day to day. I want to teach my children to respect the land and the people who were here before us. I want to grow old with a woman I love, watching grandchildren play in the yard." He paused. "What about you?" "I want all of that too. Security, love, purpose. I want to use my hands to create beautiful things, to make clothes that make people feel good about themselves. I want a home filled with warmth and laughter. I want to wake up beside someone I love and go to sleep knowing I'm valued." She lifted her head to look at him in the dim light filtering through the window. "I want you, Thomas." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "You have me, Penelope, for as long as you want me." "Forever, then." "Forever." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the night peaceful around them, the cabin warm and safe. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the loft window and the sound of birds greeting the day. Penelope woke first, taking a moment to orient herself before remembering where she was and who she was with. Thomas was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful in repose, his breathing deep and steady. She took the opportunity to study him properly. The strong lines of his face, the dark stubble on his jaw, the way his long hair fell across the pillow. Even in sleep, he looked powerful, his muscular shoulders and arms evident beneath his shirt. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. "Good morning," Thomas said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning." Penelope smiled. "Did you sleep well? Better than I have in years." "You, wonderfully." They rose and climbed down from the loft. Thomas built up the fire while Penelope washed up and tidied her hair. He made coffee and fried eggs with bacon for breakfast, the simple meal tasting delicious in the cool mountain morning. "We should start back to town after breakfast," Thomas said, though he sounded reluctant. "I want to get you home before dark." "I know, though I wish we could stay longer. We'll come back, often if you want." "I do want, very much." They packed up and saddled the horses, both moving slowly as if prolonging their departure would somehow make the time last longer. Before they left, Thomas showed Penelope one more spot, a small grove of aspen trees whose leaves rustled and shimmered in the breeze, creating a sound like water. "This is where I want to marry you," he said suddenly. Penelope turned to him, her eyes wide. "What? I know we haven't talked about marriage officially. I know we've only known each other a month, but I also know my own mind and I know what I want. I want you to be my wife, Penelope. I want to build a life with you, raise a family with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me?" She launched herself into his arms, kissing him fiercely. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Thomas held her tight, his face buried in her hair, feeling a profound sense of rightness wash over him. "We'll do it properly. I'll come into town next weekend and talk to the preacher. We can be married at the church if you prefer, or here in this grove. Whatever you want." "Here," Penelope said immediately. "In this beautiful place that means so much to you. With just a few close friends as witnesses. Something simple and real." "That sounds perfect." The ride back to Petaluma was filled with plans and dreams. They discussed where they would live initially, settling on Thomas's cabin for now with plans to expand it before winter. They talked about how Penelope would continue her sewing work, perhaps building a reputation that would allow her to work from home, creating custom garments for people in town. They debated names for future children, laughing at some suggestions and seriously considering others. As they approached the outskirts of town, reality began to intrude on their happiness. They would face questions and possibly judgment from people who wouldn't understand their quick courtship. But they'd also face each other, and that was all that mattered. Thomas left Penelope at Mrs. Chen's boarding house as the sun was beginning to set. He helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. "I'll be back next Saturday to see the preacher and make arrangements," he said. "That gives us a week to be certain this is what we both want." "I'm already certain, but I understand. Take the time if you need it." "I don't need it for myself, but I want to give you the chance to reconsider without feeling pressured." Penelope reached up and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him soundly. "I'm not going to reconsider." "You're stuck with me, Thomas Aldridge. Good." He kissed her again, then forced himself to step back. "I'll see you next Saturday." Mrs. Chen was waiting in the parlor when Penelope came inside, her expression knowing. "You look happy." "I am. We're getting married." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I know it's fast and people will talk, but I don't care. I love him and he loves me and we're going to build a life together." Mrs. Chen stood and embraced her. "I am happy for you. Thomas is a good man and you deserve happiness. When is the wedding?" "We're not sure exactly. Next weekend he's coming to talk to the preacher. We want something simple, probably in a few weeks, as soon as it can be arranged." Over the following week, Penelope floated through her days in a state of joyful anticipation. She threw herself into her work at the dress shop, but her mind was constantly on Thomas and their future together. She began making herself a simple but beautiful wedding dress, white cotton with delicate embroidery, practical enough to wear again but special enough for the occasion. True to his word, Thomas returned the following Saturday. He met with Reverend Patterson, the preacher at the small church in town, and arranged for a wedding to take place 2 weeks hence on a Saturday afternoon. The Reverend was slightly disapproving of the quick courtship, but agreed when Thomas assured him of his serious intentions and his ability to provide for a wife. Thomas and Penelope spent that afternoon walking through town, making their plans public, facing the gossip head-on. Some people were supportive, like Jim Sullivan at the trading post, who clapped Thomas on the back and congratulated him. Others were more reserved or openly critical, particularly some of the society women who thought Penelope was rushing into marriage too quickly. "Let them talk," Thomas said when Penelope seemed bothered by some of the comments. "We know the truth of what we feel. That's all that matters." They spent the evening at Mrs. Chen's, having dinner with several of the other boarders who had become Penelope's friends. The gathering was warm and celebratory, with good food and laughter and genuine happiness for the couple. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Penelope finished her wedding dress and made Thomas a new shirt from fabric she bought with her sewing earnings. Thomas came to town twice more during that time, bringing supplies to his cabin and making improvements to prepare for Penelope's arrival as his wife. He built a larger table, added more shelves, constructed a proper wash-up area with privacy. He also began plans for expanding the cabin the following year, drawing rough sketches of what a second room and eventually a full second floor might look like. The night before the wedding, Penelope lay awake in her room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Tomorrow she would become Penelope Aldridge. Tomorrow she would leave this room and this life behind and step into a new existence with Thomas in the mountains. It was everything she wanted, but the magnitude of the change still felt overwhelming. There was a soft knock on her door and Mrs. Chen's voice called quietly, "Penelope, are you awake?" "Yes, come in." Mrs. Chen entered carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. She sat on the edge of the bed and handed 1 cup to Penelope. "I thought you might like some company. The night before a wedding can be long." "Thank you." Penelope sipped the tea, grateful for the warmth and the companionship. "Were you nervous before your wedding?" "Terrified, Mrs. Chen said with a smile. "I was marrying a man I barely knew and traveling to a country I had never seen, but it was also the greatest adventure of my life. My husband was a good man, and our years together, though not enough, were happy ones. I'm not terrified exactly, but I am nervous. Everything is changing so fast. That is natural, but I have watched you and Thomas together. The way he looks at you, the way you light up when he enters a room, this is real love. It will not always be easy, but it will be worth it. Thank you for everything you've done for me. I wouldn't be here, wouldn't have found Thomas if you hadn't given me a safe place to land. You would have found your way. You are stronger than you know." Mrs. Chen patted her hand. "Now try to sleep. Tomorrow is a big day." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, not a cloud in the brilliant blue sky. Penelope woke early and bathed, then carefully dressed in her new gown. Mrs. Chen helped her with her hair, pinning it up in an elegant style and weaving wildflowers through it that Thomas had brought from the mountains the day before. A small group gathered at Mrs. Chen's boarding house at mid-morning. Penelope, Mrs. Chen, Thomas, Jim Sullivan from the trading post, and Reverend Patterson. They rode out together toward Thomas's cabin, planning to hold the ceremony in the aspen grove as Penelope and Thomas had decided. Thomas rode beside Penelope, unable to take his eyes off her. She looked beautiful in her simple white dress, her hair adorned with flowers, her face glowing with happiness. He traded a winter's worth of furs for the gold ring that now rested in his pocket, simple but well made, exactly right for her. When they reached the aspen grove, the trees were shimmering in the breeze, creating that water-like sound that Thomas loved. The small group dismounted and formed a semicircle. Thomas and Penelope stood facing each other, holding hands as Reverend Patterson began the ceremony. The words washed over them, familiar and traditional, but when it came time for the vows, Thomas spoke from his heart. "Penelope, I promise to love you and care for you all the days of my life. I promise to provide for you and protect you, to value your opinions and respect your dreams. I promise to build a home with you where love and laughter are more abundant than any material wealth. I promise to be faithful and true through good times and hard times, through whatever life brings our way." Penelope's voice was steady as she replied, though tears shone in her eyes. "Thomas, I promise to love you with all my heart, to support you and stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to make our house a home, to value the life we're building together above all else. I promise to be your partner and your friend, your lover and your companion. I promise to be faithful and true for all the days of our lives." Thomas slipped the gold ring onto her finger, and Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife. When Thomas kissed his bride, the small group of witnesses cheered and applauded. They celebrated with a simple meal at the cabin, Mrs. Chen having brought food enough for everyone. Jim Sullivan had contributed a bottle of whiskey, which he passed around for toasts. The mood was joyful and warm, a celebration among friends. As the afternoon wore on, their guests prepared to return to town. Mrs. Chen hugged Penelope tightly. "Be happy, my dear, and come visit me when you come to town." "I will, I promise. Thank you for everything." Jim Sullivan shook Thomas's hand. "You're a lucky man, Aldridge. I know it." Finally, they were alone. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Thomas took Penelope's hand and led her inside the cabin, closing the door behind them. "Hello, wife," he said softly. "Hello, husband." Penelope smiled up at him. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." He pulled her close, kissing her gently. "Are you happy?" "Happier than I ever thought possible." That night, they truly became husband and wife in every sense of the word, their love expressed in tenderness and passion, in gentle touches and whispered words. The cabin walls held their joy and their promises, the beginning of a life truly shared. The months that followed were a period of adjustment and discovery for both of them. Penelope learned the rhythms of mountain life, the daily tasks of tending the garden, preserving food for winter, helping Thomas with his trap lines. She proved to be a quick learner and surprisingly hardy. The soft-seeming woman from Sacramento had a core of steel that thrived in the challenges of wilderness living. Thomas, for his part, learned what it meant to share his life with another person. Simple things, like coordinating meals and sleeping schedules, required negotiation. But more profound things, like making decisions together and considering another person's needs and desires, transformed him from a solitary man into part of a partnership. They made the trip to Petaluma every few weeks for supplies, and so Penelope could maintain her sewing connections. She had built up a small but loyal clientele who appreciated her skilled work, and the extra income, modest as it was, gave them breathing room for improvements to the cabin and small luxuries. As autumn painted the mountains in gold and red, Thomas began the expansion he'd planned. With help from Jim Sullivan and a few other men from town, he added a second room to the cabin that would serve as a proper bedroom, allowing them to use the loft for storage. They also dug a root cellar for storing vegetables and preserved foods through the winter. Winter arrived with the first snow in November, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wonderland. Penelope discovered she loved the winter in the mountains, the quiet beauty of it, the way they were snowed in together for days at a time with nothing to do but tend the fire, raid, talk, and make love. It was during one of these snow-locked periods in late December that she realized she was pregnant. She told Thomas on Christmas morning, her hands trembling as she placed them over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby. Sometime in the summer, I think." Thomas's face transformed with joy. He dropped to his knees in front of her, placing his large hands over hers. "A baby. We're going to be parents. Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He looked up at her, his eyes bright with tears. "You've given me everything, Penelope. A home, love, purpose, and now a child. I don't have words for what I feel." "Then show me." He did, with kisses and touches, with gentle reverence for her body that now carried their child, with whispered promises of the life they would give this baby. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. As Penelope's belly grew, Thomas became even more protective and solicitous, insisting she not overexert herself, making sure she ate well and rested often. She found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating, his tendency to hover, but she understood it came from love. They made plans for the birth. Mrs. Chen had recommended a midwife in town, a woman named Martha Carver who had delivered dozens of babies over her 30 years in California. Thomas insisted they move to town a month before the baby was due, taking a room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house so Penelope would be close to the midwife when her time came. The baby arrived on a hot July afternoon in 1873, almost exactly a year after Thomas had first seen Penelope struggling with those logs. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Thomas, pacing outside the room where Penelope labored, felt more fear than he'd ever experienced facing down a grizzly bear. But finally, after 16 hours, he heard the thin, angry cry of a newborn. Martha Carver opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Aldridge, a healthy, strong boy, and your wife is fine, exhausted but fine." Thomas entered the room to find Penelope propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant as she held a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "We have a son, Thomas. Look at him." Thomas approached almost reverently, looking down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the miniature hands waving in the air. Something in his chest cracked open at the sight, a well of love so deep it was almost painful. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered. "You're both perfect." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, putting his arm around Penelope and looking down at their son. What should we name him? They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their baby, Penelope said, "What about Samuel, after your father?" "Samuel Aldridge." Thomas tested the name. "I like it. Samuel Thomas Aldridge." "Samuel Thomas Aldridge," Penelope repeated. "Our son." They stayed in town for 2 weeks after Samuel's birth, giving Penelope time to recover before making the journey back to the cabin. Mrs. Chen doted on the baby, as did several of the other women in town. Even the gossips who had criticized the quick courtship and marriage had to admit that Thomas and Penelope seemed genuinely happy, and that baby Samuel was a beautiful, healthy child. The journey back to the cabin was slow and careful, Thomas leading Penelope's horse while she cradled Samuel against her chest. When they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, Penelope felt a profound sense of homecoming. This was where they belonged, the three of them in this beautiful wild place. Life settled into a new rhythm, now shaped by the needs of an infant. Samuel proved to be a good baby, healthy and strong, with a loud cry when he was hungry or wet, but generally content. Thomas was a devoted father, spending hours simply watching his son sleep, marveling at the tiny perfect features. As the months passed and Samuel grew, Penelope regained her strength and resumed her routines. She continued her sewing work when she could, often with Samuel sleeping in a basket beside her. Thomas taught her to shoot a rifle properly, insisting she know how to protect herself and their son if he was away checking trap lines. The seasons cycled through their changes. Autumn with its brilliant colors and harvest work, winter with its deep snows and cozy evenings by the fire, spring with new growth and baby animals, summer with long days and warm nights. Samuel grew from infant to toddler, taking his first steps in the cabin, speaking his first words, growing strong and healthy in the mountain air. When Samuel was 2 years old, Penelope became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1875, arriving quickly and with less difficulty than Samuel's birth. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew in profusion around the cabin every summer. With 2 children, the cabin felt smaller, and Thomas began planning a more substantial expansion. Over the following year, he worked on adding a second story with 2 proper bedrooms, one for them and one for the children. It was hard work, but Jim Sullivan and several other men from town helped during the construction phases, and by the autumn of 1876, the expanded cabin was complete. It was a beautiful home now, solid and spacious, with glass windows and a proper kitchen area, a parlor space with comfortable furniture that Thomas had built himself. Penelope had made curtains for the windows and quilts for all the beds. She'd planted flowers around the exterior, creating a real homestead in the wilderness. Life was good, sometimes hard, but deeply satisfying. Thomas continued his trapping and hunting, providing meat and furs that supplemented Penelope's sewing income. They were never wealthy in monetary terms, but they had everything they needed and most of what they wanted. More importantly, they had each other and their growing children. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved exploring the woods with his father, learning to track animals and identify plants. Rose was more spirited, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes, fearless in her explorations of their mountain home. In 1877, when Samuel was 4 and Rose was 2, Penelope became pregnant for the 3rd time. She was 31 now, Thomas was 37, and they were utterly content with their life. This 3rd pregnancy resulted in twin boys, born in the dead of winter during a snowstorm. Thomas had to deliver them himself, when the storm made it impossible to reach town and the midwife. It was terrifying and miraculous in equal measure, and when it was over and Penelope lay exhausted but alive with 2 tiny sons nursing at her breast, Thomas sent up a prayer of gratitude to whatever powers watched over them. They named the twins Daniel and David, and suddenly their house was full to bursting with the noise and chaos of 4 young children. It was exhausting and wonderful. Penelope and Thomas had to work as a team to manage the daily needs of their family, but they did so with humor and grace, supporting each other through the difficult moments and celebrating the joyful ones. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new blessings. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, a natural outdoorsman who could track and hunt with skill beyond his years. Rose became an accomplished seamstress, learning from her mother and showing talent for creating beautiful things. The twins, Daniel and David, were inseparable and constantly getting into mischief, keeping their parents on their toes. Thomas and Penelope's love deepened with time, the passionate romance of their early days maturing into something even more profound. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared experience, and unwavering commitment. They still made time for each other, still sought out moments of privacy for romance, despite the demands of raising 4 children. They still took walks together in the aspen grove where they'd been married, still held hands and stole kisses when the children weren't looking. In 1885, when Penelope was 39 and Thomas was 45, they celebrated their 13th wedding anniversary. The children, now ranging from 12 to 8 years old, conspired with Mrs. Chen to throw their parents a surprise party. The whole family made the trip to town, where they found Mrs. Chen's boarding house decorated with ribbons and flowers, a feast prepared, and friends gathered to celebrate. Jim Sullivan stood and made a toast to Thomas and Penelope Aldridge, who proved that sometimes love really does strike like lightning. and to show that a quick courtship can lead to a long and happy marriage. May you have many more years together." Everyone raised their glasses and drank, and Thomas pulled Penelope close, kissing her soundly despite the catcalls and laughter from their children and friends. That night, lying in bed in the guest room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, with their children asleep in the next room, Penelope turned to Thomas. "Do you ever regret it? Marrying so quickly, tying yourself to one place and one person instead of remaining free in the wilderness?" Thomas pulled her closer, his arms strong and sure around her. "Not for one single moment. You and our children are the best things that ever happened to me. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's cold and empty compared to the warmth of having a family, having you. I would choose this life 1,000 times over, even though it's been hard sometimes. Even though we've struggled with money and weather and raising these wild children, especially because of those things. Easy doesn't build character or create memories worth keeping. What we've built together, this family, this home, this life, it matters. It's real and true and worth every difficulty we've faced." Penelope kissed him, pouring 13 years of love and partnership into the gesture. "I love you, Thomas Aldridge, more now than even on the day we married. And I love you, Penelope Aldridge. You're still the woman I saw struggling with those logs, too stubborn to quit, too proud to ask for help. But now you're also my wife, the mother of my children, my partner in everything. You're my whole world." They made love quietly, mindful of their children in the next room, celebrating their anniversary in the most fundamental way two people who love each other can. The years continued to roll forward. The children grew and eventually began lives of their own. Samuel, at 19, took over much of the trapping and hunting work, allowing Thomas to slow down slightly as his body began to feel the effects of decades of hard physical labor. Rose, at 17, got engaged to a young man from town, a carpenter's apprentice who'd won both her heart and her parents' approval. The twins, now 13, were beginning to show signs of which paths they might follow, Daniel drawn to mechanical things and David to artistic pursuits. Through it all, Thomas and Penelope remained the center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They were in their late 40s now, their hair showing threads of gray, their faces lined with years of laughter and worry and life lived fully. They were still strong, still healthy, still deeply in love on a summer evening in 1889, 17 years after they'd first met. Thomas and Penelope sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were all inside, the older ones helping the younger with various tasks. It was peaceful, this moment, filled with the satisfaction of a life well lived. "You remember that day?" Penelope asked quietly, "when you first saw me trying to move those logs?" "Every detail," Thomas replied. "Your hands were bleeding, you were exhausted, but you wouldn't give up. I knew right then that you were special, though I didn't yet know how special. I thought you were just a kind stranger who felt sorry for me. I had no idea you'd become my whole world." Thomas took her hand, the same hand he'd wrapped so gently all those years ago, now bearing the marks of years of work and wearing the gold ring he'd given her. That's the miracle of love, isn't it? How it starts with one small moment, one decision to help or to accept help, and grows into something that shapes everything that follows. "Do you think we've built a good life?" Penelope asked. "The best life. We have healthy children who know they're loved. We have a home that stood against storms and time. We have each other and we have memories enough to fill a dozen lifetimes. What more could anyone ask for?" "Nothing," Penelope agreed. "Absolutely nothing." As the sun finally sank below the horizon and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Thomas and Penelope remained on their porch, hands clasped, surrounded by the life they'd built from that chance meeting so many years before. The mountains stood eternal around them, witness to their love story, guardian of the home they'd made. Inside, their children's voices rose in laughter over something, the sound drifting out through the open windows. Samuel was teaching the twins how to carve wood, passing on skills his father had taught him. Rose was putting the finishing touches on her wedding dress, every stitch filled with love and care. This was their legacy, not wealth or fame, but love passed down through generations, strength taught by example, kindness modeled in daily actions. From bleeding hands to clasped hands, from a desperate struggle to a peaceful evening, from strangers to soulmates, from a mountain man alone to a family filled with laughter and love. The story that had begun with one act of compassion had grown into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of love, and the courage to build a life together against all odds. And as Thomas and Penelope sat together in the gathering darkness, their hearts full and their hands still clasped after all these years, they knew without question that they had found what every person searches for: a love that lasts, a home that shelters, and a family that endures. The mountains would stand long after they were gone, but the love they'd built would continue in their children and their children's children, a legacy more valuable than gold, more enduring than stone. This was their happily ever after, not perfect but perfectly theirs, a Wild West love story written in bleeding hands and gentle wrapping, in hard work and tender moments, in sacrifice and joy, in all the small choices that add up to a life worth living. And in the years that followed, as grandchildren arrived and filled the expanded cabin with new laughter, as Rose married her carpenter and Samuel found his own bride, as the twins pursued their different paths, Thomas and Penelope remained the steady center, the proof that true love exists and endures. They grew old together as they'd promised, their love deepening with each passing year, their commitment never wavering. When they finally passed, within months of each other in their 70s, they were buried in the aspen grove where they'd been married, their graves marked with simple stones bearing their names and the dates that bracketed their beautiful life together. And their children, gathering in that grove to say goodbye, told the story to their own children of how it all began. With a mountain man who saw a woman's bleeding hands and chose kindness, with a woman who accepted help and opened her heart, with two souls who recognized each other and chose love. That story became legend in the family, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest acts of compassion. That home is built not of logs but of love, and that a life lived with honor and devotion is a life well lived indeed. The cabin still stood decades later, maintained by descendants who used it as a retreat, a place to remember their roots and the love that had started it all. And sometimes, visitors to that cabin swore they could hear laughter on the wind, could feel the warmth of an enduring love that even death could not diminish, could sense the presence of two souls who had found their forever in the wild mountains of Northern California. This was their story, complete and beautiful, a testament to the power of love to transform lives, to create family from strangers, to build home from wilderness, and to prove that sometimes the best things in life begin with one person reaching out to help another, with bleeding hands wrapped gently, with work shared freely, and with hearts opened bravely to the possibility of love.